I grew up believing adulthood was something you survived rather than enjoyed, because everyone around me treated life like a long endurance test whose reward always lived somewhere in the future, just out of reach. The adults I knew woke up tired, rushed through their days, and collapsed into their evenings as if living itself were a chore they needed rest from. Money was the invisible sun we all orbited, dictating moods, choices, and silence at the dinner table. I learned early that curiosity was indulgent, rest was suspicious, and joy needed justification. The unspoken rule was simple. Do what is necessary now so that someday you can finally live, even though no one could explain when that someday would arrive. As I grew older, I followed the map that was handed to me. Study hard, choose something respectable, stay busy, stay afraid, and never admit you might want something different. I became skilled at productivity, but disconnected from meaning, good at planning, but terrible at presence. Even when things went right, a strange emptiness lingered beneath the accomplishments, like background noise you only notice when everything else goes quiet. I watched years pass measured in deadlines and obligations, telling myself this was maturity, this was responsibility, this was what winning looked like. Yet somewhere beneath the routines and rationalizations, a quieter voice persisted, asking questions I tried not to hear. Why does a good life feel postponed? Why does earning a living feel like trading pieces of myself away? Why does wonder disappear the moment we call something work? I didn't have answers then, only discomfort, only the growing realization that if I kept living this way, I might someday wake up with security in my hands and no memory of how I arrived there, no relationship with the person I became along the way. That realization didn't arrive like a crisis or a breakdown. It arrived slowly, patiently, waiting for me to finally stop being busy long enough to notice that the life I was building looked impressive from the outside, but felt strangely uninhabited from within. The discomfort I felt didn't push me to change immediately. Instead, it sharpened my awareness, like a low ache that makes you notice every movement. I began observing my own life as if it belonged to someone else, noticing how my days were shaped less by intention and more by momentum. Weeks disappeared into routines I never consciously chose, and conversations revolved around schedules, productivity, and vague future relief. I realized how often I postponed simple pleasures, walks, books, creative thoughts, because they didn't seem earned yet, as if existence itself required prior approval. The more efficient I became, the more fragile I felt, because my sense of worth depended entirely on staying useful, available, and busy. Still, I told myself this was temporary, that endurance was a phase and fulfillment would arrive later as compensation. But later kept moving. Promotions changed nothing. Stability felt thinner each time I touched it. I watched people around me age into their routines, speaking nostalgically about passions they once had, as if curiosity were a childhood illness they had thankfully outgrown. That frightened me more than uncertainty ever could. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I began asking different questions. Not how to get ahead, but how to stay awake. Not how to maximize outcomes, but how to reduce regret. I noticed that the moments when I felt most alive were unplanned and unmonetized. Writing without purpose, wandering without destination, learning without credential. These moments didn't make me richer, but they made me present. And presence felt like a form of wealth no one had warned me about. The tension between these two ways of living grew impossible to ignore. I wasn't unhappy enough to quit everything, but I wasn't honest enough to say I was content. I stood suspended between safety and sincerity, sensing that sooner or later I would have to choose whether my life was something I merely managed or something I actually participated in. The idea of change stopped feeling abstract the moment I allowed myself to experiment without demanding certainty, because certainty had never protected me anyway. I didn't burn everything down or announce a transformation. Instead, I made small, almost invisible adjustments that felt safer than they actually were. I began carving out time not to escape my life, but to examine it, treating curiosity as a practice rather than a reward. Early mornings became quieter, slower, filled with reading, writing, and thinking without an agenda. Evenings stretched longer when I stopped numbing them with distraction and let silence ask its uncomfortable questions. I noticed how much of my energy had been spent performing stability rather than experiencing it, and how easily fear disguised itself as responsibility. The more I paid attention, the clearer it became that exhaustion wasn't proof of effort, just evidence of misalignment. I started reducing what I didn't truly need, expenses, commitments, explanations, and discovered that simplicity created space not only in my schedule, but in my mind. That space made room for ideas I had ignored for years, ideas that didn't promise security, but offered meaning. I tested them cautiously, sharing my thoughts publicly, creating things without knowing where they would lead, allowing interest rather than strategy to guide me. Some experiments failed quietly, others surprised me, but all of them taught me something essential. I was more adaptable than I had believed, and fear lost much of its authority once I stopped treating it as truth. What emerged wasn't confidence, but clarity, a growing understanding that a life designed solely around avoiding risk eventually becomes the riskiest choice of all. For the first time, the future felt uncertain in a way that was honest, and that honesty, though unsettling, felt lighter than the constant performance of control. What began as experimentation slowly turned into a different way of structuring my days, not around obligation, but around energy and attention. I stopped asking what would look impressive and started asking what I could return to consistently, without resentment. Work became something I assembled rather than endured, built from small, flexible pieces instead of one towering demand. I learned how to earn in fragments, through writing, teaching, collaborating, sharing ideas, none of which could fully support me alone, but together formed something surprisingly resilient. The absence of a single identity felt uncomfortable at first, yet liberating, because no single failure could erase me anymore. My relationship with time changed most of all. Mornings belonged to thought instead of urgency, afternoons to focused creation, evenings to rest without guilt. I worked fewer hours, but they were honest hours, free from the dull anxiety of pretending productivity while waiting for exhaustion. Money became clearer and quieter once it stopped being the only measure of success. I earned enough, not all at once, but steadily, and learned that enough was not a temporary stage before wanting more. It was a decision. People around me questioned the stability of this arrangement, mistaking unpredictability for danger, but what they couldn't see was how fragile my old life had been, balanced entirely on constant output and suppressed dissatisfaction. This new structure was imperfect and evolving, yet it allowed me to remain present inside my own days, and that presence turned out to be the most valuable return on effort I had ever experienced. I wasn't free from responsibility. I was finally aligned with it, and alignment required far less force than fear ever had. I no longer believe there is a single correct way to live, but I am certain that fear should not be the architect of our days. Looking back, I see how easily caution disguises itself as wisdom, convincing us to trade curiosity for control and call it maturity. The life I live now is not free from effort, uncertainty, or responsibility. It is simply honest about them. I still plan, still earn, still worry at times, but those concerns no longer dominate every decision or define my sense of worth. Wonder has returned not as an escape from reality, but as a way of engaging with it more fully, noticing what is here instead of fixating on what might go wrong. I understand now that postponing life in the name of security creates a permanent delay, one that quietly erodes attention, relationships, and self-trust. By choosing alignment over approval, I gained something more durable than certainty: the ability to inhabit my own experience without waiting for permission. Work no longer feels like something I survive in order to reach life later. It feels like one expression of a larger, ongoing conversation between who I am and how I spend my time. If there is a lesson in this shift, it is not that everyone should live the same way, but that fulfillment requires participation, not just management. A life designed to be fully controlled will always feel smaller than it needs to be, while a life that allows room for wonder, presence, and enough can remain flexible without collapsing. I don't know exactly where this path leads, and that uncertainty no longer feels like a flaw. It feels like evidence that I am awake, engaged, and finally moving through my days rather than waiting for them to end.